hospital, plasma, oxygen, interdimensional relay unit, plasma coolant, hydrofusion modules. Yes! Huh? I can rearrange them. Oh dear. Oh! Crap! Son of a...
That is one ugly ass fly.
Welcome to my first ever video game review, yay! Today, I'm reviewing Dr. Muto for the original Xbox. I recently found this game when I was digging into the game section at a local pawn shop. I was really surprised to find this game sitting on the shelf and happily picked it up and bought it. This game isn't in mint condition, but who cares? I love being thrifty. Anyhow, let's get to the background information for this game. Dr. Muto was released back in the Dark Ages known as the year 2002. Although I have the Xbox version, this game was also available on the PS2, GameCube, and even Game Boy Advance. It was developed by the now deceased Midway Games, a company that created many video game masterpieces such as Mortal Kombat, NBA Jam, and Miss Pac-Man. Damn girl, you looking pretty sexy. Unfortunately, Dr. Muto didn't get as much fame or praise as Midway's other creations. Despite having Midway's popular brand name, the game sold poorly and has been in extinction for many years. Literally, this game is so unknown that the wiki solely dedicated to the game only contains 6 pages. There's not even an estimate of how many copies were sold. I mean, a shitty game like Rock Revolution had an estimate of how much of it was sold, but Dr. Muto has none. To tell you the truth, the only reason I know of this game's existence besides buying it at a pawn shop is because I remember playing it at a friend's house years ago. Other than that, I've never heard of this game. With this game being so unknown and there being no good video review of it, I decided to make this game my first video game review. So, is this one of the great video game gems long forgotten, or a mutated piece of shit that should have never been created? Let's experiment and find out. Our story starts off with the future hopelessly still virgin Jimmy Neutron, Dr. Muto sleeping on his couch. I'm sorry, but the resemblance is just uncanny. Another strange thing about Dr. Muto and Jimmy Neutron is the fact that the game came out a couple months after the show first aired. The Adventures of Jimmy Neutron Boy Genius aired on July 20th, 2002. Dr. Muto was released as early as November 19th, 2002. Perhaps Dr. Muto and Jimmy Neutron are somehow related? I don't know for sure, but it's entirely possible. Anyhow, as Dr. Muto catches some Z's on his sofa, we hear all about his life story with the help of his family album. As you can tell, he was obviously a very popular kid in school.
Hey, Muto! Finally made yourself a date, huh?
The camera then shifts to a news anchorman talking about Dr. Muto and his latest experiment to save Planet Midway from a power crisis. Yes, the planet in which Dr. Muto lives on is named after the developers of the game. Why? Capitalism. That's why, children. Hooray for capitalism! The footage then cuts to a view of Planet Midway from space. All the while you hear who I assume is President John F. Kennedy counting down to the launch of Dr. Muto's power-saving device. Unbeknownst to all of them, The main villain, Professor Bernatol, has sabotaged the machine. And just what happens when the president flips the switch? Well, this happens.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1! Is that it?
Yep, it blows up the entire planet. Whoops. And the only survivors are Dr. Muto, his loyal servant Janky, and his sarcastic yet helpful computer Al. I know, shocker, the main characters and his allies live. But what I find hilarious is Dr. Muto doesn't find out about any of this until Janky points it out for him.
What? Oh, thank goodness. It was only a dream. How's about a little snack? Yes, something in here. Moldy. Mayonnaise.
Doctor! Doctor!
Janky, no begging. Just get your own snack, would you?
But doctor,
Something in here.
look!
What the? Oh, crap.
I mean, you gotta be one hell of a sleeper to be able to sleep through a huge explosion like that. I don't know, maybe he's just sleep deprived. So basically the rest of the story is Dr. Muto travels to different planets in his evil twin brother's empire to retrieve pieces for an invention called the Genitor 9000 that will put Planet Midway back together. It's definitely not the greatest, most compelling story you will ever hear, but it is a pretty unique story. Seriously, where else have you heard of someone blowing up their home planet and having to reassemble it back together? Nowhere? That's what I thought. You play as the mad scientist Dr. Muto and travel from planet to planet collecting various objects that will help you rebuild Planet Midway. The first level involves you running around Muto's house trying to collect isotopes, or else we'll all die. I don't really understand the purpose of this level, other than it lets you get used to the controls and explore the doctor's crib, which is actually pretty nice. He's got a pool, he's got an automatic sliding door, he's got a lava lamp, he's got pornographic pictures next to his bed. Wait, what? I guess old habits die hard, if you know what I mean. Anyhow, once you collect 15 isotopes, you turn yourself into a mouse and venture into the basement and retrieve the telescope guidance chip. Yeah, one of the key mechanics of this game is Dr. Muto can transform himself into 5 different creatures to help him through certain areas and levels. He can transform into a strange-looking gorilla, a flying squirrel, grasshopper, beaver type thing, a fugly fish, the creepiest spider I've ever seen, and a mouse, which is just adorable! Aww. Also, Dr. Muto's a vampire. Either that or his mirror's broken. Anyhow, after you retrieve the guidance chip, you get to control the telescope and travel to any planet you want. Of course, since you're starting out, you can only go to planet Toltec. Completing a planet unlocks another planet to explore. There are 4 planets in total to choose from. There's Toltec, the junkyard planet, Aquem, the water planet, Flotos, the gas planet, and Mazon, the planet where the main villain is located, which is just a big mining facility. Each planet is divided into several different areas, each divided into different parts. Confusing, right? Here, let me explain. For example, Toltec has 4 different regions. There's the junkyard, then there's the vats, then the factory, and finally Vinny's dump. Each of these are not all one big area, at least according to the maps and translocators. Each area has an entrance, interior, and ending. Geez, so complex. So basically each planet has its own complication of levels. This is a good thing because you truly only get 4 planets to explore, so they need to be very lengthy to make the game last longer than, say, 4 hours. My favorite planet was, against better judgment, Flotos. It had the most variety for me despite the fact that it gave me some of the hardest challenges. While the first 2 areas, the sphere and the cube, are practically the same because they're both floating buildings with floating platforms surrounding them, the next 2 are a lot different from the rest. There's the furnace, which is a huge fire lava level, and Jupiter City, which is a small industrial town that involved you climbing the sides of buildings, climbing through a lava cavern, and flying in and out of conveyor belts. Man, it's a lot of diversity. Also, the enemies reminded me of some of the Dreamweaver enemies in Spyro the Dragon, which is a game I love. At the beginning of every area, you have 3 hearts. You can increase them by 1 by collecting 20 heart valves. You can have up to 6 hearts, although you can have another 20 heart valves which kinda act like a shield. So technically you can have 7 hearts, but you don't get to keep them if you die or return to the lab. You go back to 3 and have to collect all of those hearts again. It is a tad bit ridiculous, but it does give the game a bit more challenge. Another thing that may be a problem to certain people is the fact that every time you collect 20 heart valves and get a new heart, Dr. Muto will say the same dialogue every time.
I feel stronger from this magic red bubbly. My health has increased.
Also, once you collected the maximum amount of health, Al would repeat the same dialogue as well.
Doctor, you already have full health.
To some people, this may be annoying, but to me, I loved hearing these pieces of dialogue, simply because it meant that I could finally take more hits. Each level or area has several missions and collectibles hidden throughout. Once you complete a mission, you receive something called a Terra piece. These things are used to fuel the Genitor 9000. Not only is Terra needed, but also isotopes and DNA. Isotopes help you unlock morph formulas. DNA is needed to obtain said morphs. You can collect isotopes by exploring each area in every planet. And DNA is collected by zapping little creatures called fauna. I know what you're probably asking. How will I know if I've already collected DNA from certain fauna and I'm not zapping the wrong one? Well, the first time you zap a fauna, a counter shows you that you have collected that DNA. Not only that, but if you then killed the fauna after zapping them, they will not spawn. And don't worry about accidentally shooting a fauna you needed to zap, because if you kill a fauna that has DNA to collect, it will automatically respawn. I found this to be a very helpful and interesting piece of programming. By using the DNA, you can use certain morphs that allow you to collect certain Terra and travel to new areas you couldn't before. Aside from a few morphs, you can also use gadgets that help you with certain missions. These gadgets are the invisibility generator, which turns you invisible, the pocket rocket, which allows you to shoot controllable missiles, the invulnerability field, which makes you invincible, the super boots, which allows you to jump higher than normal, the rocket boots, which shoot you straight up in the air like, what else, a rocket, and of course the doctor's handy dandy spliz gun, which allows you to kill enemies and zap electrical switches on. Each morph has its own special abilities. The first morph is the mouse. The mouse can fit into small spaces, double jump, and can destroy pretty much anything by whipping its tail. Literally, you can destroy robots made of metal with that tail whip. Either these bots are made with some pretty cheap scrap metal, or you have Pikachu's Iron Tail. The controls for the mouse were fine. I had no problems controlling the mouse or with the mouse's mechanics in general. In fact, the mouse had to be my favorite morph when it came to its certain sections. Since you're so small, you can travel into big machine parts. And if there's one thing the Sly series has taught me, it's that big machine parts equals awesome platforming segments. This morph also provided some of the most fun platforming challenges for me. The next morph is the gorilla or ape. The gorilla can climb, swing, and ground pound enemies. Again, I had no problems with controlling the gorilla morph. The only thing I didn't like about him was the monkey bars section. I mean, climbing around was okay, but swinging from bar to bar and attacking enemies could be difficult. The game doesn't tell you this, but when swinging from bar to bar, you need to jump at the top of your swing. This caused me to die a lot of times in the same section before I figured it out. And attacking enemies is so hard to position sometimes. You attack by kicking them into a wall or wherever. The only problem is the type of enemy the game sends to attack you. It's this little floating orb bots that will shoot you at intervals. They only shoot at you when they're really close to you, and since your attack is so close ranged, you might end up getting shot off and fall to your death. The third morph is the spider, and dear God do I hate the spider. The spider can climb webs, shoot webs, and lay explosive bombs. This had to be my least favorite morph because the controls were so complex and the sections you had to explore as the spider would take too long and could end up confusing you. Sometimes you could get turned around and wind up going back to the place you were already at. Plus, to make matters worse, you can't jump. Morph after that is the guppy or fish. The guppy can swim underwater and shoot spikes or roll into enemies. The controls for the guppy were pretty smooth when swimming. The only problem I had was with the combat. It was so difficult to attack enemies underwater. Since you were given no targeting system and, not to mention, enemies charge or shoot at you, you'll have to swim away, turn around, and attack from afar. At least, that's the best strategy I've found. Charging into them wasn't always the best thing, seeing as their projectiles could hurt you, which in a way is bullshit. I will admit, I did later learn that by pressing the black button, I could turn 180 degrees around in a quicker time than manually turning myself. But this is still a little bit too much just to fight these enemies. Another problem I had was with the whole diving mechanic. You can't swim along the water's surface because by pressing forward on the left analog stick, you start swimming down. This also screws with the camera and makes it hard to swim to certain platforms. So to be able to swim at the surface, you have to change back into Dr. Muto. It's not that big of a problem, it's just it would be easier and more practical if you could swim along the water's surface in guppy form. Still, the guppy was probably my second favorite when it came to more specific sections, since you travel underwater, which in turn is like a new world, much like the mouse sections. The fifth and final morph is the flying squirrel. The flying squirrel can fly, duh, but can also shoot hairballs at enemies like projectiles. Hairballs. Really? He's a squirrel with a beaver tail and all you can come up with is hairballs? He's not even part cat, at least from the looks of it. Sure, this is a very necessary attack while flying, but you don't even use your tail on the ground. I mean, honestly, if you're specifically gonna have an animal have something as specific as a beaver tail, why not let it use it? It seems the only purpose this design feature has is to remind you that you're not flying. Okay, I get it. I'm on the ground, not in the air. Would you please, for the love of God, stop that? What are you, a dog? Matter of fact, what the hell aren't you? You're a goddamn beaver, grasshopper, flying squirrel, hybrid mutant shit! Anyhow, despite my little pet peeve about the tail design, this has to be my favorite morph in the game. I know, kinda surprising for me to say that after that rant. I just hated that one underuse of a design choice. I didn't hate the morph overall. The reason I like this morph is simply because I could now fly over all the annoying shit in a level and get to where I really wanted to be. The great thing about flying with this morph is you can do it easily whenever you want. Just by pressing A, you jump and take off. And even if you run into a wall and start to fall, you can start again in mid-air by pressing the A button. Although you gotta be quick about it sometimes. There are also some missions that require you to get into a turret and blast shit up, which are pretty fun. Well, that's all there is to the gameplay. Now let's talk about presentation. This game looks good for a 2002 game. The graphics are pretty solid. Character models and objects are detailed to a great degree, and the cutscenes, though few and far between, look great. There's nothing I can really point out that's bad about them, considering the timestamp of the game and the hardware limitations at the time. The only thing that kinda looks bad is the setting of Toltec, which is pretty dull and not specifically detailed. But then again, it's a junkyard, so it doesn't have to look that spectacular. Other than that, nothing else looked that terrible. Of course, these aren't the greatest graphics you'll ever see, but remember this game came out in 2002 on the original Xbox. So all in all, the graphics get the job done at the very least. The environments all have a good amount of detail to them. The best looking planet is without a doubt Aquem. It was so bright and colorful and great to look at. Apart from graphics, these planets can serve as environmental lessons for gamers. Each level portrays a different form of pollution harming the planet's environment. Toltec is filled to the rim with trash and has toxic spills all over the place. Aquem has pipes dumping oil right into the water. Photos no longer has a crust due to it being burnt up for valuable fuel. And Mazon is being drilled full of holes by Bernatol. They're subtle references, but they can convey an important message. This game also has a lot of mature-ish content that seems like it wouldn't have. Not only are there pornographic pictures on the walls like I said earlier, but Dr. Muto and some bosses say things like damn, hell, ass, and bastard. However, the developers apparently drew a line at the F-bomb, because they bleep it out anytime Dr. Muto says it.
Where the am I?
Along with this mildly adultish content, some very goofy and sarcastic humor, most of it coming from Al and Dr. Muto. I'm serious, this game made me laugh out loud a few times. Dr. Muto's a complete goof himself. Everything he does and says is just wacky and crazy.
I'll need a machine, some resources, a way to convert generic matter to planetary matter. Eureka!
Hell, his victory dance involves him air humping. And Al, being a computer that has such a high intellect that has formed its own personality, gives sarcastic remarks or advice that tends to mock you and some of the game's logic.
You're getting closer to the whirlpool, Doctor. It is up ahead, through a series of caves. Try not to get lost in there. This area? Oh, it's a memory puzzle. You still have your memory, don't you, old man?
This game had a lot of humor, which I haven't seen in much video games nowadays. Especially the one part where you first get to use a spider morph and you talk to Al. I'd show you, but I don't want to ruin for you what is, in my opinion, one of the best and most surprising lines in the game. If you really want to know, go skim through a playthrough to where I said and listen. Or, matter of fact, just play the game. I'm gonna warn you right now that the condition of my game was not that great when it came to this area. When characters would talk sometimes they would break up during words, and at one point in the game the background sound just stopped completely and didn't pick back up until a later level. So I may not provide the most reliable information when it comes to sound. However, I do believe these problems weren't enough to sway my overall opinion of the game's audio, so let's get into it. The sound effects were good. They were all wacky and cartoony, pretty much like they should be. They're not annoying or of terrible quality. The only problem I had was Dr. Muto's jumping grunt. His grunt didn't even sound like his character. It sounded like somebody else's. I mean, I would think that Dr. Muto's jumping grunt would be more like heck, but instead it's... An upside to this problem is that you only hear it when jumping around Muto's house. On other planets, it's mostly drowned out by your jet boots. This is a small detail anyway, so it's not that big of an issue. Although a nice touch in the sound effects department is the addition of a sound effect for the guppy swimming along the bottom of the water. While you swim along the bottom, your tail makes splashing sounds against the sand. This is a really nice addition, as it could have been the same as normally swimming through the water, so kudos to the sound effects coordinators for that. Overall, they did a good job. The music was great, at least when you heard it. I'm not sure if my game's sound being messed up had any role in the music, but all I know is the music doesn't play loud enough. It gets so overlayered by just the sound effects. Normally you can hear the music more than the sound effects, but in this game it's opposite. However, when I did hear it, it was nicely composed. The voice acting was pretty good to me. The one thing I have to note is that there's mainly one voice actor throughout the entire game. Seriously, the voice actor for Dr. Muto, named Wally Field, does the voices for pretty much every character in the game. The only two characters he doesn't voice are Carla and Steel, so 90% of the voice acting is all from one guy. Damn, Wally, I know your paycheck was huge. This little fact, however, still didn't deter my personal thoughts on the voice acting. Dr. Muto and Al's voices fit them perfectly. Dr. Muto has a nerdy and jittery way of speaking, pretty much like a mad scientist would. Al has a robot or sentient voice. It's pretty much like all other talking computer programs. A clear voice with no real emotions. Well, yes, he does have a sarcastic personality, but he doesn't show any emotions in his words. He has basically the same tone throughout the entire game. Moving on, I can't really say much for the bosses. Their lines are pretty limited. They do have some lines they say during fighting, but you don't really pay that much attention to it because you're busy fighting them. The only other time they talk is when you defeat them, and that in of itself isn't that many lines. But from what little I heard, it was of the same quality as Dr. Muto and Al. Their voices fit them and their personalities, which are shortly described to you in the master plan pages for their boss battles, perfectly. Janky is another character I can't give an exact opinion on. I mean, he only has like 2 lines throughout the entire game. Yeah, in case you haven't noticed, Dr. Muto's most loyal assistant, one of the most would-be main allies for Dr. Muto, is never mentioned or seen in the game past the opening. That, to me, is kind of a slap to the face. I'm not saying that because I love Janky and he's my favorite character. Really, how can I like the guy when he only has 2 lines and 2 scenes? It's just that why would you include someone as close-knit to the story as Janky and never even just mention him? He's supposed to be Dr. Muto's most loyal servant. How can someone given that title be found absolutely nowhere in this game? At the very least, you could have had him standing somewhere in Dr. Muto's lab. Maybe he didn't have to talk or really do anything, just be there. But I guess the developers are trying to say Janky's really one shitty assistant despite his high title. In this case, there's really no point. He serves no real purpose. In fact, the only purpose he serves is to let Dr. Muto know that the world is blown up. But that's not that huge of a purpose. The story could have been written so Dr. Muto found out some other way. For example, say he walks up to his window and stretches like he would in the morning to see, I don't know, the weather outside. After he stretches, he would see that he was floating in space and that planet Midway is no more. It's a very simple rewrite. I think the real problem was the fact that Midway was actually pressed for time to complete this game. Perhaps they wanted to do more with Janky's character, but simply didn't have the time. This is the explanation for some of the problems with the game. Speaking of problems, that brings me to my next category. While this game is relatively fun and well designed, it does have some problems. One of the first main problems is there's no targeting system. Well, okay, that's not entirely true. You are able to target enemies as the flying squirrel, but that's only one morph. This makes fighting enemies a pain in the ass sometimes. Not only would you need a targeting system for the guppy, but for Dr. Muto in general. The game will sometimes throw a group of enemies at you, and you have to fend them off using your spliz gun. However, since your gun isn't a laser beam or a machine gun, it becomes difficult manually aiming at one enemy and shooting them then doing the same thing to the next as they circle around you. You can shoot continuously by holding down the B button, but at the rate you shoot, you might as well just stick to shooting one shot at a time. And some enemies you're put up against have shields that require you to zap them. This means that you will have to shoot and avoid enemies at practically the same time. So being able to automatically aim at an enemy and avoid them would be a whole lot easier. I will admit, you can strafe, but strafing doesn't do jack diddly shit for aiming at enemies, and it's almost useless when it comes to dodging. Another thing I didn't like about this game is after you collect all the DNA samples in the game, the appearances of your morphs change. The mouse becomes a rat, the gorilla turns into a mech gorilla, the spider turns into a roach, the guppy turns into an eel, and the flying squirrel turns into a bat. I hated these costume changes, as I called them, because it gave the morphs a worse appearance. The mech gorilla looks like crap to me and makes no logical sense. How do you go from mammal to robot from adding more DNA? The roach was... oh god. I honestly didn't know they could make the spider even creepier. He reminds me of that creepy roach from Courage the Cowardly Dog. The bat was meh to me. The thing I didn't like was it kept the same sound effects from the flying squirrel, so every time you take off, land, or run into something you sound like a squirrel. It really would have been better if they changed the audio clips to that of a bat. The rat I probably hated the most. I mean, they take the cutest, most easy to look at morph and turn it into an ugly monster rat! I will admit though, this was the only costume that made that much sense. A scientist can have lab mice and or lab rats, so it only makes sense the mouse's alternative costume be a rat. Still, I didn't like these costume changes at all. The only one I liked was the electric eel. It made the guppy look more badass. I know what you're all saying by now. Roy, why don't you change the costumes back then if you hate them so much? Well, there's just one little problem with that. You can't do it. Yep, once you collect enough DNA to change the morph's appearances, you're stuck with that for the rest of the game. And it's not like these permanent changes grant you special abilities or anything. At least from what I could tell, the costume changes did not improve any of my abilities. This whole thing was just unnecessary in my eyes, and definitely not worth collecting every sample of DNA. This game is also pretty bad at explaining your controls for your morphs in Dr. Muto. The descriptions for the morphs only give you the basic controls. They don't explain everything. A good example of this is with the spider. By pressing the B button, you lay an explosive egg. That's what the game will tell you. What the game won't tell you is by going into first-person view, and when you press B, the eggs will fly forward and stick to objects and destroy enemies. It's pretty much like you're using a sticky grenade launcher. I don't know why the game wouldn't tell you such a great and useful tool. This technique makes it easy to destroy obstacles. Some of the levels designs are a bit flawed too. For example, in the waterworks area in Quem, there's a warehouse that contains 3 pieces of Terra. The main paths I have to go to obtain these pieces of terror are along the walls of the warehouse and on top of the drills placed throughout. As for the warehouse floor, there's really nothing that important to collect or do. However, for some reason or another, the developers decided to add these heat-detected platforms that will only move when you are the gorilla. This is the only time this platform mechanic ever occurs. The only items to collect are isotopes, but they don't justify you jumping along these platforms. If they were part of a Terrapiece challenge, then they would be. You're not even needed to get to the raised sides of the warehouse. All you have to do is double jump as a gorilla and you're up there. So there wasn't really any point to the platforms in the middle. There could have been nothing but a floor there. Another flawed design is the mission Dead Man Jumping. The object of this mission is to jump along these tower platforms while using the invisibility gadget to avoid getting shot up by the turrets on a nearby tower. The actual objective isn't hard, it's just the actual challenge of it can be easily eliminated. You see, before you get to the first invisibility gadget to start the mission, you come across the pocket rocket gadget. The reason why this gadget is even in this section is beyond me. However, you can use the pocket rocket to guide missiles that can destroy all the turrets surrounding the tower. Ergo, the real threat of the mission is eliminated and you can platform easily. This was a really stupid addition. I mean, why even bother giving a mission which specifically asks you to use the invisibility gadget when you could just destroy the whole problem? Instead of Dead Man Jumping, you might as well have called it Destroy the Purpose and Jump. To fix this, either the developers would need to remove the pocket rocket gadget from this area or change the purpose of the mission entirely. Perhaps these odd choices remain simply because Midway ran out of time. A little known fact I found out about this game is that during Dr. Muto's development, the developers started to run out of time and had to crunch to get the game completely finished. This can explain the odd level design choices not giving the costume changes any added abilities and the exclusion of janky. This also was the cause behind a certain problem when it came to collecting isotopes in the hydro station. Here's how this problem all started. When it came time to place the isotopes, the programmers just placed them willy-nilly and never changed it. Well, as all artists know, the level artist's personal opinions changed. In the underwater cave section of the hydro station, the level artist increased the size of the cave walls. This change encased certain isotopes inside of them. Eventually the programmers found out and had to decide on whether or not to change the isotopes' placements. They decided not to, saying that collecting 100% of the isotopes would be no different than collecting 80% of them. This fact is of course true, as collecting all isotopes will grant you nothing other than self-satisfaction for completing the game 100%. Also, they said they were running out of time. So, sorry to all you completionists out there, but it's pretty much impossible to beat this game 100%. Since we're on technical problems, that brings me to my next topic. This game's rendering distance is horrible. Sure, the load times are quick and you can see the whole environment with no fog, but the rendering distance for small objects was awful. Things like crates, enemies, and even isotopes couldn't be seen from far away. This makes finding practically anything a lot harder. The places to explore are so huge and the main collectibles are so tiny, and since they don't have a great rendering distance, you will have to travel along every nook and cranny to find them. Also, since you have to get close to see enemies, enemies could potentially attack you before you can. This is just really ridiculous. I mean, I always thought that it was harder to render a whole environment than render tiny objects, but apparently in this game it's the other way around. One more sort of bad thing about this game is the ending is kinda confusing. What do I mean by confusing? Well, this game has two possible endings. There's the first one, which is obtained by collecting just enough Terra to use the Genitor 9000. The second one is obtained by collecting all the Terra pieces. By themselves, they're really confusing or stupid. However, as it turns out, the two endings you unlock, plus the intro that plays at the start screen, are essentially the game's ending. So yeah, unfortunately I did show you some of this game's ending, but there's still a good portion of it left. The order in which the ending is supposedly played out is first ending 1, then the intro, and finally ending 2. Apparently if we sit idle at the start screen, we see like a vision into the future or something, but I thought it was an explanation to the game's mechanics. Man, I really don't know. All I know is this is the only game I've ever played where the ending was broken up and scattered all over the game. I really wish Midway had kept it simple. Well, that's all the bad things I picked out of this game. Now to my overall opinion. This is a great and fun game to play. It has some great humor, a lot of challenge, unique gameplay mechanics, and lots of hours of gameplay. It's well made overall. The only major problems that truly affect the game are the horrible rendering distance, lack of targeting system, unnecessary costume changes, and somewhat faulty level designs. However, these problems don't completely break the experience of the game. It does make it a tad bit less enjoyable, but the experience is still great. As for what version I'd recommend the Xbox version. The color of the Xbox case fits well with the game, because it's a green title and a green case. Developers seem to have felt the same way, as the Xbox version is the only one that has a real-life controller on the pause screen. Not only do I like it cosmetically, but technically it has to be better. Contrary to popular belief, the PS2 was not the most powerful console back in those days. Actually, Microsoft's Xbox was the most powerful console. It better be as heavy as this piece of shit is. Another little fact is, this is also why the last two installments of the Oddworld games were only on Xbox. Since this game has a horrible rendering distance for objects, it more than likely has the best rendering on the Xbox, the most powerful console. If the rendering distance is this bad on the Xbox, dear God, I can only imagine how bad it is on the other consoles. Still, this game is a real gem. Literally, you look up gem in a dictionary and you'll see a picture of Dr. Muto's fugly ass face staring back at you.
Ugh.
You're probably wondering why this game didn't get more attention. It got great reviews on IGN and fair reviews on GameSpot, which I personally don't agree with. I think the main reason this game didn't get much attention is because of the time it was released. In case you didn't know, back in 1996, Super Mario 64 brought the rise of the 3D platformer. Along with this revolutionary movement came the releases of a lot of 3D platforming games. This craze continued into 2002. Holiday 2002 saw the releases of Super Mario Sunshine, Sly Cooper and the Thievius Raccoonist, Spyro Enter the Dragonfly, Blinks the Time Sweeper, Ratchet and Clank, and finally Dr. Muto. This game more than likely got overshadowed by all these other games since it was new and didn't really have a cult following. Plus, I'll admit, the cover doesn't look that appealing. If you ask me, this game is definitely not a game to pass up, whether you're a major 3D platformer fan or not. This has easily become one of my top favorite games. Yeah, that tells you how good this game actually is if it's become one of my favorites. I give this game a score of 6 mutant flies out of 7 with a play choice of I and a ranking of...
Excellent.
Why is 7 my highest score, you may ask? Because everyone else does either 5 or 10. Plus, it's a lucky number. But 7 isn't a very even number. Well, fuck you, it's my grading system. This has been my review of Dr. Muto. I hope this video wasn't too long. I believe the main reason this review was so long is because there was so much to cover in this game. Also, I played this game for a long time, at least 10 hours in total, probably more. So I think I noticed a lot more little things to nitpick about. But either way, I hope you enjoyed and will play this game in the future, somehow. Thanks for watching.
We're way out! In a galaxy far away lives a tyrant named Burn-It-All. He rules to this day. The galaxy Centralis had 7 worlds. So crazy Dr. Muto and his plan unfurled. He's Dr. Muto! A mad scientist, Dr. Muto! Mad scientist, Dr. Muto! The mad scientist! Dr. Muto lived on planet Midway, where things were getting bad, or so they say. Dr. Muto tried to create his own power, so Midway wouldn't have to be charged by the hour. Now Midway was starting to get in a jam, but when Muto turned it on, Midway went kablam! He's Dr. Muto, the mad scientist. He's Dr. Muto, and he ain't never been kissed. He's Dr. Muto, and now his rep has been dissed.
Excellent. Finally, my butt was getting tired from all of this jumping around.